The countdown had already started when she found the shaft. 71 hours. That was what the clutch loss specialists would have calculated, had any of them been present, had any of them known that the last gravid female of the Valethorn line had dragged herself through 9 kilometers of condemned freight ducting beneath Terminal Korath to reach this place, a maintenance bay so far below the active decks that even the station's own environmental logs had stopped polling it 6 years ago. Rithani Valethorn pressed her flank against the curved wall and let her breath come in slow, deliberate pulses. The thermal plating here was dead, had been dead for years. But the rock beneath the plating still carried warmth from the geothermal bore that fed the station's lower grid, and when she pressed her belly to it, when she spread her wing membranes flat against the curve and let the heat soak upward through the dermal vents along her ribs, she could feel the clutch settle. Not safe. Not yet, but settling, the way a held breath settles when the lungs find their floor. 3 eggs, 2 viable, 1 uncertain. The uncertain one sat lowest in the cavity, pressed against her pelvic ridge where the old fracture had healed crooked. She'd carried it 6 weeks longer than the others because it refused to calcify, refused to harden into the smooth thermal shell that a Valethorn egg was supposed to form by the 4th week. The specialists on Drenmar had wanted to flush it, reabsorb, let the nutrients redistribute to the viable pair. Senior Specialist Cathan had laid the absorption protocol on the examination platform like it was a courtesy, and Rithani had read the document line by line while the monitoring harness measured the clutch's thermal output, and the 2 viable eggs pulsed steady and strong, and the uncertain one flickered. She had refused. Cathan had explained the risks. A 3rd egg that would not calcify was a drain on the nesting chemistry, pulling thermal resources from the viable pair, increasing labor time, narrowing the delivery window. The pelvic fracture, an old injury from a rockfall on the Valethorn Highland, healed without proper setting because the nearest bone specialist had been a 3-day transit away, and Rithani had walked it off the way Valethorn females walked everything off would make the passage dangerous. The egg could rupture in the canal. The membrane fragments could cause infection. The viable pair could be compromised. She had refused, and then she had left Drenmar in the dark. And now she was here, in a dead maintenance shaft on a freight station no Valethorn had set claw on in 40 years, and the countdown was running. 71 hours to lay, 48 to thermal bond the shells, 12 more for the wax seal that would let her move them. 131 hours total, if nothing went wrong. Everything had already gone wrong. The hatch above her head clanged. She coiled, every spine along her dorsal ridge locked upright, the keratinous plates fanning into a ridge that doubled her apparent height. Her tail swept behind the belly curve and her forelimbs planted not to fight, not yet, but to shield. The angle of her body made a wall between the hatch and the place where the eggs would come, and her jaws parted just enough to let the heat-loss vents behind her molars flare. The vents glowed faintly amber in the dim shaft, a warning visible across the entire M spectrum. A promise. Anything that came through that hatch would meet 400 kilograms of nesting fury before it touched the floor. The hatch opened. A mop handle came through first. Then a bucket. Then a pair of boots so worn that the sole tread had been re-glued twice she could see the adhesive lines even in the low light. 2 different shades of industrial bond, one older and darker than the other. The boots found the ladder rungs. The bucket swung. A man climbed down into the shaft, back to her, humming something tuneless through his nose, and he didn't see her until he'd already set the bucket on the floor and turned to check the drainage grate. He stopped. She held. He was old. 60, perhaps. 65. Human, obviously they were the only species that moved with that particular combination of stiffness and stubbornness, joints protesting every step but the steps happening anyway. He wore a maintenance uniform the color of wet concrete, stained at the cuffs and across the chest with years of chemical residue that no wash cycle had fully removed. A name patch on the left breast read THURSK in block letters. The stitching was coming loose at the H. He looked at her. She looked at him. The shaft was perhaps 4 meters wide, and he was standing in the only exit. "Well," he said. Her spine stayed locked. Her heat vents stayed open. She could feel the clutch pressing, the first egg beginning its descent into the upper canal, and the timing was catastrophic. She could not fight and lay at the same time, could not split the musculature, could not afford the hormonal spike that combat readiness would dump into a system already running on nesting chemistry. If he ran, if he reported, she would have to move, and moving now would crack the uncertain egg. The membrane was tissue thin. One sharp contraction during a panicked ascent through the freight ducting and the uncertain egg would burst inside her, and the fragments would do exactly what Cathan had warned they would do. She made the sound. Low, not a growl. A growl was aggression, and aggression would trigger her own combat cascade. This was the other sound, the one that came from the thoracic resonance chamber, the one that meant "do not make me choose." It vibrated through the floor plating and into the stone beneath. It was not a sound any human was supposed to understand. The man looked at the mop in his hand. He looked at her belly, at the way her wing membranes were spread flat against the warm wall, at the slow, rhythmic pulse of her flank. He looked at the drainage grate and at the bucket and at the hatch above. "Right," he said. He set the mop against the wall. He sat down on the bucket, slowly, the way old humans did when their knees had opinions about gravity. He put his hands on his thighs and exhaled through his nose. "I'm Khalid," he said. "I do the lower deck rounds. Nobody else comes down here. They took this sector off the active roster 6 years ago when the thermal grid failed." He paused. "You're nesting." It was not a question. She didn't answer it. "I raised goats," he said. "Back on Carrick before I came out here, 20 years of goats. I know what nesting looks like." He rubbed his knee, the left one, the one he'd been favoring on the ladder. "How long do you need?" She did not understand why he was still sitting. Every protocol she had ever been taught, every cautionary file, the Conclave distributed to females who might encounter humans outside diplomatic channels, said that a human who discovered an unlicensed dragon on a station would trigger a containment alert within 90 seconds. The alert would bring armed response. Armed response would bring sedation teams. Sedation during active labor would kill the uncertain egg and likely damage the viable pair. The containment protocol was not designed for malice. It was designed for safety, the safety of the station, the safety of the crew, the safety of a species that most humans still classified as unpredictable megafauna. The protocol did not account for a mother who had nowhere else to go. The man was not reaching for his comm unit. He was rubbing his knee and waiting. She lowered her spines. Not all of them. The dorsal ridge stayed up, a concession to instinct she couldn't override, but the lateral spines along her jaw folded flat, and her heat vents narrowed to their resting aperture. She was still 400 kilograms of armored mother between him and the clutch, but she was no longer 400 kilograms of armored mother about to strike. 5 days, she said. The words came thick. She had not spoken a trade language in weeks, not since the freight hauler who had carried her from the Koreth Transit Junction to the station's lower docks, a taciturn Kaleshi captain who had asked no questions and charged her nothing, and told her the maintenance shafts on sublevel 11 were warm. 5 days, and I will take them and go. Khalid Thirsk looked at the dead thermal plating. He looked at her wing membranes pressed against the stone. He looked at the faint amber glow still fading from her heat vents, and at the belly that pulsed with the slow rhythm of a body doing the hardest thing it would ever do. He nodded once, stood up from the bucket, picked up the mop, and climbed back up the ladder without saying anything else. She listened to his boots on the rungs. She listened to the hatch close. She listened to the silence that followed, and she waited for the alarm, the station-wide containment tone that would flood the corridors with security personnel, and end everything she had crossed 4 transit corridors to protect. It didn't come. She waited, every muscle locked in the coiled position, ready to surge through the hatch and into the freight ducting the moment the alarm sounded. The ducting would be cold and dark, and she would lose the geothermal warmth, and the uncertain egg would almost certainly not survive the thermal shock of rapid transit. But she would be moving, and moving was better than waiting for sedation teams in a dead-end shaft with no secondary exit. The alarm didn't come. 5 minutes. She counted the seconds by the rhythm of her own respiration, 12 breaths per minute, 60 seconds per 5 breaths, the math running automatically in the part of her brain that was not consumed by nesting chemistry. 10 minutes. She eased her coil by a fraction, shifting her weight from the combat-ready position to the half-guard that allowed her to maintain the thermal bridge to the stone wall. 15 minutes. She pressed her belly back against the warm rock and felt the clutch settle again, the eggs responding to the returned warmth with the faintest increase in activity movement she could feel but not see, the pre-laying shifts of organisms preparing for the transition from body to shell. 20 minutes passed, 30 an hour. The contraction cycle continued, slow and heavy, the first egg descending through the canal in increments. The shaft was quiet except for her breathing and the faint geological hum of the geothermal bore far below. She pressed her belly harder against the warm stone and held. 41 floors above, in the administrative ring of Terminal Korath, a Veilthorn Conclave courier named Drasen Vale had been awake for 36 hours. The tracking array on Drenmar had registered the gravid female's departure 11 days ago. The departure itself was not unprecedented. Females of high-stress bloodlines occasionally sought isolation for nesting, an instinct the Conclave's breeding specialists attributed to pre-social memory patterns dating back to the cave roost era. The Veilthorn females were especially prone to it. Something in the line, some deep-code territorial reflex that the Conclave's domestication protocols had never fully smoothed, drove them to seek unfamiliar ground when the clutch was ready. The archivists called it the old walk. The breeding specialists called it a liability. What was unprecedented was the duration and the distance. Rithani Veilthorn had not gone to a sanctioned nesting site. She had not filed a solitary nesting request with the Breeding Oversight Committee. She had crossed 4 transit corridors, switched freight haulers twice, and dropped off the Conclave's tracking grid entirely at a junction point in the Korath sector that hadn't been actively maintained in years. The tracking array on Drenmar had pinged her biosignal twice during transit, once at the Kaleshi freight junction, once at the Korath docking ring, and then nothing. 11 days of nothing. Drasen spread the search maps across the borrowed desk in the station's Port Authority office and pressed his forklaw into the bridge of his snout. He'd been dispatched from the Veilthorn Eyrie on Drenmar with a simple mandate: find her, assess the clutch, report to the matriarch. The mandate had not included instructions for what to do if the tracking grid returned no signal. The station's lower levels were environmentally decommissioned, and the Port Authority's records showed no dragon arrivals or departures in the last 3 years. The Veilthorn bloodline had produced 6 clutches in the last 30 years. 3 had survived to hatching. Of those 3, 1 had produced viable offspring that carried the resonance markers the Conclave's archivists considered essential for harmonic continuity, the deep register overtone that anchored the Veilthorn contribution to the Conclave's collective memory structure. Without it, an entire harmonic thread in the Conclave's shared resonance architecture would go silent within 2 generations. The archivists described this in technical terms. The matriarch described it differently. The Veilthorn voice would die. Rithani's clutch was the 7th. The genetic assay from Drenmar had flagged 2 of the 3 eggs as carrying the resonance markers. The 3rd was uncertain, undercalcified, possibly non-viable, its resonance signature too faint to read through the shell. The specialists had recommended reabsorption. Standard protocol. redirect resources to the viable pair. Rithani had looked at Senior Specialist Cathan and made a sound that cracked the observation window. Not metaphorically. The window had fractured along a stress line in the laminate, and the facility had logged it as a structural failure because no one wanted to write a report that said the patient disagreed. Now she was gone, and the clutch was somewhere in this station. And Drasen had 31 hours before the nesting window closed, and the eggs either bonded to a thermal source or died. Pull the environmental logs for every sublevel below the freight decks, he told the Port Authority liaison, a thin woman named Corson with a data tablet and an expression that said she had not expected a Valethorn courier to be sitting in her office at 4 in the morning. Every thermal reading, every motion sensor, every atmospheric scrubber report. I need anomalies. Those sublevels have been offline for. I know, pull them anyway. Corson pulled them. The data was patchy. 6 years of environmental neglect had left gaps in the sensor coverage, but the atmospheric scrubbers on sublevels 9 through 14 were still running on emergency power, cycling the air at minimum capacity. Drasen scanned the readings. CO2 levels on sublevel 11 were elevated by a fraction, consistent with a large organism breathing in an enclosed space. It wasn't proof, it was a direction. He marked the sector and opened the station's personnel database. Khalid came back 4 hours later. Rithani heard him on the ladder, the same boots, the same careful placement of each foot, the same tuneless humming that she was beginning to associate with the particular frequency of a human who meant no harm. When the hatch opened, she was mid-contraction, the first egg moving through the final stretch of the canal, and her entire body was rigid with the effort of holding still, while something the size of a human head pressed through muscle and cartilage and membrane. Her claws had scored lines in the deck plating. Her wing membranes trembled against the wall. He came down the ladder carrying a portable heating unit. Industrial, meant for curing pipe sealant. She could read the faded label on the housing. Thermal Cure Model 9, max output 340 Kelvin. It was old, dented, and it had a frayed power cable that he'd wrapped in electrical tape. Under his other arm he carried a folded utility blanket, gray, standard issue for overnight maintenance shifts. He didn't say anything. He plugged the unit into the emergency power socket by the drainage grate, a socket Rithani hadn't known was there, recessed into the wall behind a panel that Khalid swung open with the practiced ease of a man who had serviced every socket on this level 100 times. He set the unit on the floor 3 meters from her, angled so the radiant heat would wash across the wall where her belly pressed. The warmth hit her flank, and something in the clutch loss calculation shifted. Not much, perhaps 2 degrees, but 2 degrees in a failing thermal environment was the difference between a calcified shell and a membrane that tore on contact. 2 degrees was the margin the specialists on Drenmar would have maintained with a 60,000 credit thermal pod. This man was maintaining it with a pipe sealant curer that had electrical tape on its power cable. She made a sound. Not the warning sound. The other one deeper from the subthoracic resonators, the one that meant the nest is holding. It was involuntary. She hadn't intended to make it. The sound came from the part of her that was not thinking about tactics or exits or containment protocols. The part that was only a mother, in a warm place, with her eggs moving. Khalid set the blanket beside the wall and sat on his bucket. He pulled a thermos from the thigh pocket of his coveralls and poured something into the cap. Steam rose, thin and pale. He set the cap on the floor between them and pushed it toward her with his foot. "Broth," he said, "salt and marrow. My wife used to make it for the does when they were kidding. Good for the minerals," she said. "I figured warm salt couldn't hurt." She looked at the cap. She looked at him. The contraction eased and the first egg settled into the canal's lowest curve, not yet laid but positioned. In 20 minutes, perhaps less, it would come, and she would need to catch it with her forelimbs and set it against the warmest section of wall before the shell began to cure. The curing process was temperature dependent. Below the threshold, the calcium matrix would not bind, and the shell would remain soft and vulnerable. Above the threshold, the matrix locked within hours, and the egg could survive independent thermal regulation. The heating unit had pushed the wall temperature above the threshold, barely, but above. She reached out with her foreclaw and took the cap. The broth was thin and tasted of bone and mineral, and it was warm, and her throat closed on the swallow because it had been 11 days since anyone had offered her anything. The Kaleshi freight captain had been kind in his silence, but he had not offered. The transit corridors had been cold. The ducting had been dark. She had carried the clutch alone, the way the old walk demanded, but the old walk had never specified that aloneness was the point, only that the nest must be chosen, not assigned. I adjusted the duty logs, Khalid said, settling himself on the bucket with the deliberate care of a man whose body had learned to negotiate with gravity rather than fight it. Nobody else is scheduled for the lower sectors this week. I do the rounds, I file the reports, nobody checks. Station management stopped caring about sub-level 11 the same year they decommissioned the grid. He rubbed his knee again. If anyone asks, the drainage grate down here is backing up and I'm running a multi-day flush cycle. Happens 3 or 4 times a year. Nobody questions it. He paused. You said 5 days. I can give you 5 days. The contraction hit. She set the cap down, turned her body, braced her forelimbs against the wall, and the first egg came. It was the size of a human head, pale gray with a faint iridescent sheen that would deepen as the shell cured, and it was warm from her body, warm from the hours of pressing against the geothermal stone, warm from the heating unit's borrowed radiance. She caught it with both forelimbs, curved her claws inward so the pads took the weight instead of the points, and set it against the wall where the heating unit's output was strongest. It settled into the curve of the stone. The shell surface began to tighten, the calcium matrix responding to the warmth, the first molecular bonds locking into place. Khalid watched from the bucket. He didn't say anything. He didn't move. He just watched, and when it was done, he poured more broth into the cap and pushed it toward her again. She drank. The egg pulsed against the warm wall. An hour later, the heating unit stuttered. The amber glow dimmed, flickered, and went out. The shaft's temperature began to drop immediately 2 degrees in the first minute, the geothermal bore alone insufficient to maintain the curring threshold. Rithani pressed her wing membranes tighter against the wall, trying to hold the heat around the egg with her own body, but the nesting chemistry had already redirected her core temperature toward the clutch. She was burning from the inside. She couldn't sustain it for long without depleting the reserves the second and third eggs would need. Khalid was on his feet before she could make a sound. He knelt beside the unit, pulled the power cable from the socket, and examined the connection point where the electrical tape met the frayed insulation. The problem was the socket itself. The emergency power contacts were corroded from 6 years of disuse, and the draw from the heating unit had built up a layer of oxidation on the terminal that was breaking the circuit. He pulled a multi-tool from his belt, the kind of battered, oil-stained toolkit that lived on maintenance workers the way scales lived on dragons, and scraped the corrosion from the socket contacts with the flat blade of a screwdriver. His hands were steady. Not fast, not rushed. Steady, the way a man's hands were steady when he'd spent 22 years fixing things that nobody else cared about in places nobody else went. "Hold on," he said. Not to her, to the egg. He said it the way he might have said it to a kidding doe in a cold pen on Carrick, when the barn heater failed and the only thing between a newborn kid and hypothermia was a man with a screwdriver and enough stubbornness to make the machine work. He reconnected the cable. The unit hummed back to life. The amber glow returned, washing across the wall, and the egg's shell temperature stabilized within minutes. The calcium matrix had not been damaged, the interruption had been too brief. The geothermal bore had provided enough background warmth, but the margin was thinner now. 2 degrees was not a comfortable buffer. It was a ledge. I'll clean the socket contacts every 4 hours, Hollid said, sitting back down on his bucket. He wrote himself a note on the back of a maintenance form he'd pulled from his coverall pocket. And I'll bring a backup cable from the supply locker. Should have done it the first time. Rithani watched him write the note. His handwriting was small and precise, the letters of a man who filed reports that no one read but who filed them correctly anyway. She realized with a clarity that surprised her that she trusted him. Not the way she trusted the Conclave conditionally, politically, with the awareness that every institution served its own continuity before it served its members. She trusted him the way she trusted her own forelimbs, automatically, without calculation. It was not a comfortable realization. The nesting instinct did not make space for trust. It made space for defense. But Hollid Thirsk was sitting on a bucket in a dead maintenance shaft at 6 in the morning, writing himself a reminder to clean a corroded power socket every 4 hours so that a dragon's egg would stay warm, and the instinct could not find anything in that to defend against. The hours passed. Hollid cleaned the socket contacts at 4-hour intervals, each time with the same careful scraping, the same reconnection, the same amber glow returning. He brought water in a collapsible jug from the maintenance office 2 levels up. He brought a second blanket, this one thicker, the kind used to wrap exposed pipes in cold sectors, and folded it into a windbreak between the drainage grate and the egg, blocking a draft Rithani hadn't consciously registered, but that her body had been compensating for. "You're burning too hot," he said, during one of his inspections. He was looking at her wing membranes, the thin vascular tissue that regulated a dragon's core temperature by radiating excess heat. They were flushed deep amber, the blood vessels dilated, the membranes working at maximum capacity. Your body's trying to cool itself down because it's overcompensating for the environment. If the shaft were 2 degrees warmer, you wouldn't have to work so hard. He thought about it. I might be able to rig a reflector behind the heating unit, bounce the heat off the wall instead of losing it into the corridor. He climbed the ladder, came back 20 minutes later with a sheet of polished hull plating he'd salvaged from a decommissioned freight container on sublevel 10. He propped it behind the heating unit at an angle that directed the reflected heat toward the egg wall. The shaft temperature rose by 1.5 degrees. Rithani's wing membranes settled from deep amber to their resting rose copper, and the burning sensation in her chest eased for the first time in 2 days. "Better," he said. She closed her eyes. Better. Outside the shaft, 41 floors above, a Conclave courier was scanning duty logs and atmospheric data and narrowing his search grid hour by hour. Inside the shaft, a janitor sat on a bucket, and a mother held her first egg and the nest was holding. Drassen found the first anomaly 18 hours into the search. A maintenance worker on the lower freight decks had filed a drainage report for sublevel 11, sector KL7, a section of the station so deep that the environmental systems had been decommissioned half a decade ago. The report itself was unremarkable. Backed-up grate, multi-day flush cycle, standard procedure. Corsen confirmed it happened regularly. The lower sublevels had aging infrastructure, and the drainage systems needed periodic manual intervention. But the report had been filed at 03:40 station time, and the duty logs showed that the maintenance worker assigned to that sector Thirsk, H, badge 4471, had been on shift for 14 hours straight. His scheduled shift was 8. He'd clocked in at 13:00 the previous day, filed standard maintenance reports for sublevels 9 and 10 at intervals consistent with normal rounds, then gone silent for 6 hours before filing the drainage report from sublevel 11 at 03:40. No one worked a 14-hour shift in a dead sector to flush a drainage grate, not at 63, not alone. Drassen pulled the worker's file. Hollid Thirsk, 63 years old, Carrick-born, a mid-range agricultural colony, terraformed 3 generations back, primarily pastoral, 22 years at Terminal Korath, all of it in maintenance, all of it on the lower decks. Performance reviews were uniformly adequate. No disciplinary notes, no security flags, no contact with any dragon species logged in his personnel record. The environmental data from sub-level 11 was sparse. Most of the sensors had been powered down years ago, but the emergency power socket in sector KL7, grid reference 11K7E4, was drawing current. A small draw, 340 watts maximum, consistent with a portable heating unit. The socket had not drawn power in 3 years. Drassen pulled the CO2 data again. The atmospheric scrubbers on sub-level 11 were running harder than their neighbors on 10 and 12, cycling more frequently, pulling more volume. Consistent with a large organism. Consistent with a nesting female whose metabolic rate was elevated by labor. He closed the file. He sat in the Port Authority office and pressed his foreclaws together and thought about what he knew and what it meant. The Conclave's standard recovery protocol for a missing gravid female was a containment team, 4 operatives, a sedation specialist, a thermal transport pod, and an armed escort. The protocol existed because a nesting female was the most dangerous configuration a dragon body could assume. Every hormonal system was redirected toward clutch defense. Pain response was suppressed. Fear response was replaced by territorial aggression so deep and so total that the female's own identity became secondary to the nest's survival. A nesting female who perceived a threat to her eggs would not posture, would not warn, would not negotiate. She would kill anything that moved between her and the clutch, and she would keep killing until the threat was gone or she was dead. The archivists had records of nesting females who had killed their own siblings, their own mothers. The nesting reflex did not distinguish, it only defended. The standard protocol assumed the nesting female was alone. If she was not alone, if she was with a human who had chosen, for reasons that Drassen could not yet map, to maintain the thermal environment for the nest instead of reporting it, then the containment team's arrival would register as a threat, multiple large bodies entering the nesting space. The sound of boots, the smell of sedation compounds. Rithani would fight. The human would be between her and the team, in a shaft too small for evasive maneuvering. And the eggs, in the chaos of a containment action in an enclosed space, would be exposed to the thermal shock that killed more clutches than any predator ever had. Drassen was still weighing the options when a second complication arrived in the form of Korath Station's security chief, a broad-shouldered human named Velander, who walked into the Port Authority office without knocking and set his data tablet on Corsen's desk, with the deliberate placement of a man who was used to his tablet being the most important object in any room. "Your dragon," Velander said. "I've been tracking the atmospheric irregularities independently. My team identified the sub-level 11 anomaly 4 hours ago." Drassen's foreclaw tightened on the desk edge. "You haven't dispatched a team." "Not yet. But I have one staged on sub-level 9. Containment protocol for an unregistered megafaunal presence on a civilian station is clear. I'm required to secure the area within 6 hours of positive identification." Velander tapped his tablet. "That clock started 4 hours ago." Drassen stood. He was taller than Velander by a full meter, and in the low-ceilinged Port Authority office, the shift in his posture changed the geometry of the room. "Security Chief, the organism on sub-level 11 is not unregistered megafauna. She is Rithani Veilthorn, a documented member of the Veilthorn bloodline, carrying a clutch that the Conclave's Breeding Oversight Committee has classified as priority critical for harmonic continuity. She is in active labor. If your containment team enters that shaft, she will interpret their presence as a threat to the clutch. She will not warn them. She will not negotiate. She will kill every person who enters, and the eggs will be destroyed in the resulting thermal disruption." Velander's expression did not change. He'd been security chief on a freight station for 15 years. He'd been told things would go badly before. I have a legal obligation. You have a legal obligation to protect the lives of station personnel. That obligation is best served by keeping your team on sub-level 9 and out of the shaft. The janitor who is currently in the shaft with her is alive because he sat down on a bucket and offered her broth. Your containment team will not sit down on buckets and offer broth. Corsen, who had been watching this exchange with the studied neutrality of a woman who had learned to survive by not being the person who made decisions, cleared her throat. The Conclave courier has filed a diplomatic priority request with the Port Authority. Under the Korath Station Charter, a diplomatic priority request from a registered Conclave representative supersedes standard security protocol for a period of 48 hours. Velander looked at Corsen. Corsen looked at her tablet. Drassen looked at both of them and waited. 48 hours, Velander said. Then my obligation overrides your request and the team goes in. In 48 hours, Drassen said, the matriarch will be here. And you will not need your team. Velander picked up his tablet and left. Drassen sat down and opened a comm channel to the Veilthorn matriarch on Drenmar. I've found her, he said. Sublevel 11, Sector KL7. She's nested. The eggs are in active curring. The power draw started approximately 18 hours ago, consistent with first egg timing, and she's not alone. The matriarch's silence lasted 4 seconds. In Conclave communication protocol, where a 2-second pause was considered lengthy, 4 seconds was geological. Who is with her? A janitor, station maintenance, lower deck rounds. Name is Thirsk. He appears to have found her during a routine inspection, declined to report her, adjusted his duty logs to prevent other workers from entering the sector, and provided a portable heating unit from his maintenance supplies. Another silence, 3 seconds this time. Is the janitor a threat to the clutch? No, matriarch. The janitor appears to be keeping her warm. Solving Veilthorn, matriarch of the Veilthorn line, senior voice on the Conclave's Breeding Oversight Committee, survivor of 6 clutches and 3 territorial disputes that the archivists still classified as wars, was quiet for a long time. Drassen could hear the background resonance of the Drenmar airy through the comm, the deep harmonic hum that the Veilthorn line produced collectively, the sound of a bloodline thinking together. Cancel the containment order, she said. I will come myself. The second egg came 6 hours after the first. This one was darker, a deep slate gray with amber veining that pulsed faintly as the shell cured, the resonance markers expressing themselves in the calcium matrix like a fingerprint writing itself into stone. Rithani caught it the same way, forelimbs curved, pads taking the weight, and set it beside its sibling against the warm wall. 2 eggs, 2 viable. The shell surfaces were already beginning to synchronize their thermal cycles, the faint pulse of each one falling into rhythm with the other, the way Veilthorn eggs had done for 10,000 years, a resonant synchronization that the archivists believed was the earliest form of the Conclave's collective harmonic. Khalid had folded the blanket into a pad and set it against the base of the wall where the eggs sat, creating a thermal buffer between the shells and the bare deck plating. The floor bleeds heat, he said. The walls warm from the bore, but the floor's just steel over rock. Steel conducts too fast, it'll pull heat out of the shells faster than the unit puts it in. You need insulation underneath. He pressed the blanket flat, smoothed the edges, tucked the corners under the curve of the wall. Same principle as kidding pens. Straw on the floor, not the walls. The mother's warm, the floor isn't. She hadn't thought of that. The specialists on Drenmar would have had thermal-controlled pods with substrate temperature regulation and humidity cycling and atmospheric composition monitoring. She had a dead maintenance shaft and a janitor's utility blanket, and the blanket was doing what 60,000 credits worth of Conclave equipment was designed to do. The egg's shell temperature stabilized within minutes of Khalid placing the insulation. The synchronization pulse strengthened. Between the laying of the second egg and the third, something happened that changed the arithmetic of her trust. A sound in the access corridor. Not claws she would have recognized, would have mapped to species and weight and intent before the second footfall landed. This was a skittering, multiple small bodies moving fast across steel deck plating. Koreth wrens, the station's persistent vermin population, a rodent analog species that had arrived on a freight container 3 decades ago and had colonized every uninhabited section of the station's lower levels. They were not large. They were not dangerous to a grown dragon, but they were attracted to calcium-rich surfaces, and dragon eggshells were the most calcium-dense biological material in the known catalog. Rithani heard them in the corridor, and her spines locked so fast the keratinous plates cracked against each other. The nesting chemistry did not calculate relative threat. It did not weigh the size of a wren against the size of a veilthorn mother and conclude that the odds were favorable. It registered movement toward the clutch, and it responded with the same total, molecular-level certainty it would have deployed against a warship. She could not move. The second egg was curring against the wall, the first egg was bonded, and her body was positioned as the thermal bridge between the two, her wing membranes maintaining the temperature envelope, her belly pressed against the stone, her forelimbs framing the eggs. If she moved to intercept the wrens, the thermal bridge would break. The curring process would stall. The second egg's calcium matrix would soften at the molecular boundary layer, and the shell integrity would be permanently compromised. She could not move and she could not stay still, and the wrens were getting closer, and the nesting chemistry was flooding her system with the same hormonal cascade that would have driven her to tear apart anything between her and the threat. And she made the sound, the do not make me choose sound, the one that came from the deepest resonance chamber, the one that shook the walls. Khalid was already standing. He'd heard the wrens before she had the human ear was tuned to vermin frequencies, a 10,000-year evolutionary inheritance from grain storage and barn maintenance, and the long agricultural history of a species that had learned to protect its food by listening for the things that wanted it. He picked up the mop. He walked to the corridor mouth, planted himself between the access corridor and the nest, and brought the mop handle down on the deck plating. Hard. The sound rang through the corridor like a bell. He brought it down again, and again. A steady, rhythmic percussion that filled the corridor with sound and vibration and the unmistakable message of a territory being defended. The wren stopped, the skittering ceased. He heard them retreat, the fast scatter of small bodies reversing direction, claws on steel diminishing into the corridor's depth. He kept striking the deck for another 30 seconds, then stopped, listened, and turned back to the nest. He looked at Rithani. She was rigid, every spine locked, her heat vents open and glowing amber, her forelimbs trembling with the suppressed need to charge into the corridor and destroy every living thing in it. The nesting chemistry was still surging. Her pupils were dilated to their combat aperture. She was looking at Khalid as though she couldn't quite resolve whether he was part of the nest or part of the threat. "They're gone," he said, quiet, calm, the same voice. "I'll seal the corridor access with a maintenance barrier. Standard pest exclusion protocol for decommissioned sectors. I should have done it when I first found you down here." He climbed the ladder, came back with a roll of industrial mesh and a sealing gun, and spent the next 40 minutes installing a pest barrier across the corridor mouth. The mesh was fine enough to stop the wrens but coarse enough to allow air circulation. He tested every seam, every junction point, every anchor bolt. When he was finished, the corridor was sealed. Rithani's spines lowered. Her heat vents cooled. The nesting chemistry receded to its baseline and the trembling in her forelimbs stopped. The eggs were undisturbed. The thermal bridge had held. Khalid sat back on his bucket. He didn't mention the wrens again. He didn't mention the mop, or the barrier, or the way she'd looked at him when the nesting chemistry was running hot. He poured broth and waited. He'd brought food, Two, not broth this time, but a packet of dried fruit and a bar of something dense and caloric that he said was a ration bar from the station's emergency supplies. "You're burning through reserves," he said, setting them on the floor within her reach. "I can see it in your wing membranes, they're thinning. The body's pulling from everywhere to feed the clutch. You need to eat." She ate. The ration bar tasted like compressed grain and industrial sweetener, and it was the best thing she had eaten in 2 weeks. Khalid checked the heating unit's power cable connection, adjusted the angle by a few degrees, and sat back on his bucket. Outside the shaft, it was his off shift. He should have been in his quarters, asleep, resting the knee that he favored and the shoulders that carried 22 years of mopping and hauling and climbing ladders in dead sectors. Instead, he was here, in sublevel 11, watching the thermal output of a pipe sealant curer and offering dried fruit to a fugitive dragon. The third egg was not coming. She could feel it, the uncertain one, the one the specialists had wanted to flush. It sat in the upper canal, pressed against the old fracture, and it would not descend. The contractions that should have moved it were coming and going without effect, the muscles working against the misaligned ridge of healed bone that narrowed the passage by nearly a centimeter. Each contraction sent a spike of pressure through the egg's uncalcified membrane, and each spike risked a rupture that would end it. The membrane was not designed to withstand repeated compression against a bone ridge. It was designed to slide through a smooth canal and emerge intact. Nothing about this was smooth. She told herself to let it go. The viable pair was laid. The viable pair was curring. She had done what she came to do. She had walked the old walk. She had found her nest. She had laid the eggs that carried the resonance markers, and the Veilthorn voice would survive. The uncertain egg had been uncertain from the beginning, and the specialists had been right, and she should let the body reabsorb it and focus on the two that would live. She could not let it go. Something in her, something older than the Conclave, older than the breeding protocols, older than the word mother in any language, refused to calculate, refused to triage, refused to accept that a clutch of 3 could be redefined as a clutch of 2 because the math was more convenient. The uncertain egg was hers. It had sat against the crooked ridge of her pelvic fracture for 6 weeks longer than its siblings, pressed into the one part of her body that was broken, and it had held. It had not ruptured. It had not reabsorbed. It had waited, uncertain, alive, refusing to die with the same stubbornness that had carried its mother across 4 transit corridors to a dead shaft on a station that no one cared about. She would not flush it. She would not let it go. She would hold the contraction and push and hold and push until the egg passed, or she did. Khalid was watching her. He'd been watching for hours, sitting on his bucket, pouring broth, adjusting the heating unit when the temperature drifted, checking the emergency power sockets connection, bringing food and water and saying almost nothing. He had the patience of a man who had spent 20 years sitting up with animals in the dark, waiting for biology to do what biology did, and he had not once tried to touch her, had not once moved closer than 3 meters, had not once made a sound louder than his own breathing and his tuneless humming. "Something's wrong," he said. She closed her eyes. The contraction came again, and the egg pressed against the fracture, and she felt the membrane give by a fraction of a millimeter. A fraction more and it would tear. "The third egg," she said, her voice was hoarse. "It cannot pass. The canal is narrowed where a bone healed wrong." Khalid was quiet for a moment. He looked at the 2 eggs curring against the wall. He looked at her flank, at the place where the contractions were rippling through the scales in visible waves. He stood up from the bucket, walked to the ladder, and climbed up through the hatch. She heard him leave, and she thought, "He's done. He's given me 2 days and 2 eggs and a blanket and a heating unit and broth and ration bars, and now the third problem is beyond what a janitor with a thermos can solve, and he's going to walk away." And she couldn't blame him. She couldn't blame anyone. The third egg was her stubbornness made physical, her refusal to accept the specialist's recommendation, her insistence that 3 meant 3 and not 2. She dragged herself across 4 transit corridors and 9 kilometers of condemned ducting for an egg that might not be viable even if it was laid. And now the egg was stuck against a bone that had broken 8 years ago on a rockfall she should have been more careful about. And no one was coming to help because she had made sure no one knew where she was. She pressed her belly against the warm wall and held the contraction and waited for the membrane to tear. The pain came in waves, not the clean, productive pain of a contraction doing its work, the grinding, static pain of an egg pressing against bone with nowhere to go. Each wave built higher than the last, crested and receded without progress. She counted them the way she had counted everything since leaving Drenmar, methodically, the way a mind counts when it has nothing else to hold on to. 14 contractions in the last hour. 14 spikes of pressure against the fracture ridge. 14 moments when the membrane flexed and held and flexed and held and did not tear. On the 15th it would tear, or the 16th, or the 20th. The membrane was not infinite. It was biological tissue, stretched beyond its design specifications by an egg that should have been smaller, that should have calcified weeks ago, that should have, according to every specialist on Drenmar and every data model in the Conclave's breeding database, been reabsorbed at the first sign of calcification failure. She thought about the last thing Cathan had said to her before she'd left Drenmar, not the clinical summary, not the risk assessment. The thing she'd said quietly as Rithani was turning to leave, the words pitched low enough that the monitoring equipment wouldn't log them. I would have done the same. Cathan had carried 4 clutches herself. 3 had survived. The 4th, the uncertain one, the one the data models had flagged, she had flushed on the specialist's recommendation. She had followed the protocol. She had redirected the resources. She had produced 3 healthy hatchlings and received the Conclave's commendation for optimal breeding outcome. She had also never spoken about the 4th egg without the particular flatness of voice that Rithani recognized as the sound of someone who had made a decision they could not take back and could not entirely live with. Rithani was not going to make that decision. She was going to hold this contraction and the next one and the one after that, and the egg was going to pass or it wasn't, and either way she would know that she had held. Khalid came back 40 minutes later. He came down the ladder carrying a bag from the station's livestock supply depot. She could read the depot's logo on the side. A stylized feed trough, and the bag contained things she did not expect. A tube of veterinary-grade lubricant, a flexible heating pad designed for reptilian livestock, a bottle of liquid mineral supplement, and a pair of latex gloves. I called in a favor with Terran on level 8, he said, setting the bag on the floor. Told him I had a reptile in the lower decks that was egg-bound. He didn't ask what kind of reptile. Terran doesn't ask questions, that's why he's good at his job. He looked at her. I've dealt with egg-bound does. The goats not look, the principle's the same. If the passage is narrowed, you need to relax the muscle around the obstruction. External heat helps. Lubrication in the canal helps. Positioning helps, angling the body so gravity assists instead of fighting. It's not complicated. It's just patience and warm hands. He paused. I know you're not a goat, but the egg doesn't know that. She stared at him. 400 kilograms of Veilthorn nesting fury, dorsal spines locked, tail coiled around 2 curring eggs and a utility blanket, every nesting instinct screaming that nothing touched her, nothing came close, nothing entered the space between her body and the clutch. The nesting reflex did not distinguish between threat and help. It only defended. The archivist's records were full of nesting females who had killed attendants who approached too quickly, too loudly, with too much confidence in their own safety. Khalid Thirsk approached with no confidence at all. He approached the way he did everything slowly, carefully, his bad knee taking each step with the deliberate negotiation of a man who had learned that the body was not an instrument you commanded but a partner you persuaded. He set the bag down 2 meters from her and waited. Show me where the bone healed wrong, he said. She showed him. She turned her body slowly, keeping the two laid eggs within the curve of her tail, and she let him see the place where the old fracture had ridged the left pelvic plate inward. The ridge was visible from the outside, a raised line under the scales, paler than the surrounding tissue, the calcium deposit from a break that had healed without proper setting. On Drenmar, the bone specialists had offered to re-break and reset it, but the procedure required sedation, and sedation during the final trimester was contraindicated for clutch integrity. Khalid knelt beside her. He pulled on the gloves. He opened the heating pad, pressed it against the skin over the fracture ridge gently with even pressure, the way you'd press a warm cloth against a sore muscle, and held it there, steady, patient. The heat soaked through the scales, through the dermal layer into the deep muscle tissue beneath, and Rithani felt the contraction pattern shift, slower, deeper. The muscles around the obstruction began to soften, the spasm releasing its grip on the egg's membrane. "When the next one comes," Khalid said, his voice low, and even the same voice he must have used in the kidding pens on Carrick, the voice that told a frightened animal that the hands were not a threat, "push hard and to the right. Away from the ridge. I'll hold the heat." She waited. The contraction built deep, slow, the softened muscles gathering differently now, the pressure angling toward the wider passage on the right side of the canal. She pushed. Hard and to the right, the way he'd said, angling the egg's descent away from the narrowed channel, and the egg moved. It slipped past the ridge with a wet, grinding pressure that made her vision white out for a moment, every nerve in the pelvic region firing at once, and then it was through, and then it was in the canal's lower curve, and then it was in her forelimbs. It was smaller than the others. Its shell was thin and slightly translucent, the calcium matrix patchy, the surface uneven where the calcification had started and started again over 6 uncertain weeks. But it was warm and the membrane was intact, and when she set it against the wall with its siblings, the thermal pulse began. Faint, irregular, but present. Khalid pulled the blanket edge around to cover the base of all 3 eggs. He checked the heating unit's angle. He poured broth into the thermos cap and pushed it toward her. 3 eggs, 3 shells curring, 3 faint thermal pulses falling into synchronization, the uncertain one lagging behind its siblings but following, the way a late runner follows the pack, not matching the pace but finding the direction. Rithani laid her head on the floor and closed her eyes and made the sound that meant the nest is whole. The sound filled the shaft. It soaked into the walls. It hummed in the drainage grate and the dead thermal plating, and the emergency power socket, and the pipe sealant curer and the utility blanket, and the boots of a janitor who was sitting on a bucket in a dead sector, watching 3 eggs cure against a warm wall, and who was not going anywhere. Drassen brought the matriarch's instruction to the Port Authority at hour 51. "No containment team," he said. "No sedation specialist. No armed escort. No thermal transport pod. The matriarch has reviewed the environmental data, the atmospheric readings, and the workers' personnel file. She is dispatching a nesting delegation, 2 attendants, a thermal specialist, and herself." Corson, the Port Authority liaison, set down her data tablet. "The matriarch is coming here, personally, to sublevel 11. The Valethorn matriarch does not send a containment team to retrieve a nesting mother who has been kept warm by a human with a blanket and a pipe sealant curer," Drassen said. "She goes herself. She has also instructed me to tell you that Terminal Korath's cooperation in this matter will be noted in the Valethorn Trade Registry, and that any attempt to file a containment report or trigger a security response before her arrival will be noted differently." Corson put the security report she'd been drafting back in her desk drawer. The delegation arrived 18 hours later, docking at Terminal Korath's upper ring in a Valethorn courier vessel, the Solen Wrath, that was older than the station, but maintained with the kind of obsessive care that suggested every rivet had been inspected by someone who remembered its installation. The matriarch descended the boarding ramp with the 2 attendants and the thermal specialist, and Drassen met them at the dock. Solving Veilthorn was smaller than Drassen most females were, until they weren't, and Solving had the compact density of a dragon who had survived 6 of her own clutches, 3 wars that the archivists euphemistically classified as territorial realignments, and the complete reorganization of the Conclave's breeding protocols after the Cathan reforms. Her scales were deep bronze, weathered to a matte finish along the leading edges of her wings where decades of atmospheric flight had stripped the polish. She moved with the slow precision of someone who knew exactly how much force every step transferred to the substrate beneath, and who had long since decided that precision was a form of courtesy. She reviewed the environmental data in the Port Authority office. She reviewed Holland Thirsk's personnel file 22 years, no incidents, Carrick-born pastoral background. She reviewed the power draw from the emergency socket, the duty log adjustments, the atmospheric scrubber data, the livestock supply requisition that had been logged under reptilian husbandry lower deck maintenance. Reptilian husbandry, she said. Yes, matriarch. He told the livestock depot his reptile was egg-bound. Yes, matriarch. The depot worker apparently did not inquire further. Solving looked at the data for a long time. Her forklaw traced the timeline on Corson's desk, the first contact at hour 0, the heating unit at hour 4, the blanket and broth at hour 8, the livestock supplies at hour 32, the second egg's thermal signature appearing at hour 22, all 3 eggs now reading viable on the atmospheric analysis. 3 eggs viable, she said, including the third. Yes, matriarch. The third egg's thermal signature is weaker and less regular than the other 2, but it is present and strengthening. The atmospheric data suggests it was laid approximately 6 hours after the second, which is consistent with an obstructed delivery followed by manual repositioning assistance. Manual repositioning assistance, Solving said. From a janitor. From a goat farmer, Drassen said, who became a janitor. Solving stood. She walked toward the sub-level access corridor, and Drassen followed, and the 2 attendants followed, and the thermal specialist followed, carrying the portable nesting substrate and the humidity regulator and the shell integrity scanner that should have been Rithani's from the beginning. They descended through the station's infrastructure in stages. The freight decks first active, noisy, the air thick with engine exhaust and the sharp chemical tang of cargo preservatives. Then the transition zone, where the active levels gave way to the decommissioned sectors, the corridors dimming, the air growing cooler, the sounds of station life fading to the deep geological hum of the geothermal bore. Sub-level 9. Sub-level 10. The corridors narrowing, the lighting reduced to emergency strips that cast thin amber lines along the floor. Velander was waiting at the sub-level 9 staging area with his containment team, 6 security officers in tactical gear, sedation rifles racked and ready. He stepped forward as the delegation approached. Matriarch Veilthorn, he said, I'm Security Chief Velander. My team is prepared to escort. Your team will stay here, Solving said. She did not slow down, she did not look at him. The diplomatic priority request covers the next 22 hours. Your team will not enter sub-level 11 during that period. If the 22 hours expire before we have emerged, you may contact Courier Vale for an update. You will not contact anyone else. Velander opened his mouth. Solving was already past him. The attendants followed. The thermal specialist followed. Drassen paused long enough to give Velander a look that communicated, with the precision of a species that had been reading body language for 10,000 years, that the matriarch was not making a request. Sub-level 11. The corridor was narrower here, the deck plating older, the walls scored with the marks of equipment that had been removed years ago and never replaced. Drassen could smell the geothermal warmth, sulfurous, mineral-rich, the deep earth smell that the Veilthorn line had built their nesting traditions around for millennia. He could also smell something else. Broth. Human food preparation. The faint, homely scent of salt and bone stock that had no business existing 41 floors below a freight terminal. They reached the corridor that led to Sector KL7. Drassen saw the pest barrier first, industrial mesh, sealed with professional precision, blocking the corridor mouth. Someone had installed a maintenance-grade exclusion system. Someone who knew how to seal a space against intrusion and had the tools and the patience to do it properly. He sealed the corridor, Drassen said quietly. Solvine looked at the mesh barrier. She looked at the anchor bolts, the sealing compound, the precise junction work. She said nothing, but Drassen had served her long enough to read the fractional shift in her jaw musculature, the Veilthorn equivalent of a nod. They removed a section of the mesh and entered. Rithani heard them coming. Not on the ladder, they came through the main access corridor, the one that connected sub-level 11 to the freight infrastructure above. Wider, designed for equipment transport. She heard claws on deck plating. She heard the particular cadence of Veilthorn movement, the weighted placement that distributed mass across 4 contact points, the slight drag of tail against steel. More than one set of claws. 4, 5. And beneath the claws, boots. Human boots. Corsen or a security escort or someone from the Port Authority, walking alongside the dragons. She coiled. Every spine locked. Every heat vent opened, the amber glow filling the shaft. Her tail swept around the 3 eggs and Hollett's blanket and the heating unit and the thermos and the livestock supply bag, and her forelimbs planted in front of the nest, claws out, the tips scoring fresh lines in the deck plating. Every gram of nesting chemistry was telling her the same thing it had told her from the first hour. Nothing touches them. Nothing enters. Nothing lives between me and the clutch that I do not permit. Hollid was asleep on the floor, 3 meters away, his back against the wall and the thermos cap still in his hand. He'd been awake for most of the last 60 hours, checking the heating unit, adjusting the blanket, bringing broth and water and ration bars, and once, a sandwich wrapped in wax paper that he'd eaten himself while she watched because he said someone in this shaft needed to model eating regular meals. He'd fallen asleep an hour ago, sitting upright, his chin dropping to his chest in increments, and she'd let him sleep because the eggs were cured and the wax seal was forming, and the man had earned his rest more thoroughly than anyone she had ever known. He woke when the corridor door opened. The sound of claws on steel was not subtle. He sat up, blinked, looked at the 5 dragons filling the corridor mouth, 2 attendants flanking a thermal specialist who carried equipment Rithani recognized from the Drenmar facility, Drassen Vale with his tablet, and in front of them all, 1 bronze-scaled elder whose presence filled the shaft the way a cord fills a resonance chamber. Hollid looked at Rithani. He looked at the dragons. He looked at the mop leaning against the wall where he'd left it 3 days ago. He stood up, picked up the mop. It was the only thing within reach, the only object in the shaft that belonged to him, and moved to stand between the corridor door and the nest. Solving Veilthorn stopped. The attendant stopped. The thermal specialist stopped. Drassen stopped. Everyone in the corridor stopped, because a 63-year-old janitor with a mop was standing in front of 3 Veilthorn eggs and a utility blanket and a pipe sealant curer, and his expression was not defiance and not courage, and not any of the heroic abstractions that the word guardian carried in the stories. His expression was the same expression Rithani had been wearing for 3 days, the flat, total, non-negotiable certainty that nothing was getting past him that he hadn't decided to let past. And Solvine recognized it. She recognized it because she had worn it herself, 6 times, through 6 clutches, through the worst hours a body could endure, and the recognition landed in her chest like a harmonic finding its octave. "He's been with me since the first hour," Rithani said. Her voice was rough from 3 days of silence broken only by necessity. "He found the shaft. He brought heat. He brought insulation. He brought food. He repositioned the 3rd egg when it wouldn't pass. He knelt beside me and held a heating pad against the fracture and told me to push to the right, and the egg came through. He adjusted the duty log so no one else would enter the sector. He has not slept in 3 days. She paused. The resonators in her chest hummed a low, steady vibration that the attendants could feel in their forelimbs. He is holding the nest. Salvine looked at Khalid Thirsk. He was still holding the mop. He had broth stains on his coveralls and electrical tape on his fingers, from rewrapping the heating unit's power cable twice when the adhesive loosened. His badge said 4471, and his name patch was losing its H, the thread unraveling from the bottom of the letter. "You brought a heating unit," Salvine said. "Pipe sealant curer," Khalid said. "It was the only portable unit I could find on short notice." "You brought lubrication and a heating pad for the third egg." "She was egg-bound, I've seen it in goats." "You compared a Veilthorn gravid female to a goat." Khalid's expression did not change. The egg didn't mind. Salvine's head lowered, not a bow that would come later if it came at all, and in forms that had nothing to do with the gesture. This was something older. Something pre-verbal. This was a nesting elder looking at a clutch that should have died in a dead shaft on a decommissioned sub-level, and at the mammal who had kept it alive with a pipe sealant curer, and a utility blanket and dried fruit and broth made from a recipe his wife had used for goats, and understanding that the Conclave's entire breeding infrastructure had been outperformed by a man who knew what egg-bound looked like, because he'd raised animals on a dirt farm on a mid-range agricultural colony. "Drassen," she said, "log the thermal source." Drassen looked up from his tablet. "The heating unit, I've already." "Not the heating unit, the man." Drassen hesitated. "Matriarch, the Conclave's nesting records don't have a category for." "Make one." The thermal specialist moved forward with the portable substrate. She set it against the wall beside the heating unit, not replacing it, Rithani noticed, but supplementing it, sliding the professional equipment into place alongside the jury-rigged arrangement that Khalid had built. The substrate's temperature controls activated, the humidity regulator began cycling, and the egg's thermal signatures stabilized on the specialist's scanner. All three viable, all three curring. The uncertain egg, the small one, the translucent one, the one the specialists on Drenmar had wanted to flush, was curring unevenly but steadily, its calcium matrix thickening hour by hour. Salvine walked past Khalid slowly, giving him room the way you moved past someone who was part of the nest rather than an obstruction in it. She reached the eggs. She lowered her head and breathed on each one, the long, slow exhalation that transferred molecular markers from a matriarch's scent glands to a clutch's shell surface. The Veilthorn equivalent of a signature, an acknowledgement, a statement older than language. These are ours. She breathed on the third egg last and longest. Then she turned to Khalid. "Your shift," she said, "is it over?" Khalid looked at the eggs. He looked at the heating unit he'd carried down a ladder at 4 in the morning 3 days ago. He looked at the blanket that was still doing its job under the edge of the professional substrate, still insulating the shells from the cold floor, still earning its place. He looked at Rithani, who was watching him with the same expression she'd had when he'd first climbed down the ladder, measuring, calculating, deciding whether the thing in front of her was a threat or a gift. "I suppose it is," he said. "No," Rithani said. Everyone looked at her. "His shift is not over," she said. She laid her head down beside the eggs, and the resonators in her chest produced a frequency that Salvine had not heard in 30 years, a deep, sustained harmonic that bypassed the audible range and registered in the bone. The nesting bond harmonic. The frequency a Veilthorn mother used to designate a clutch guardian. It was not a title. It was not a rank. It was a sound that meant this one stays, and it was the oldest protocol the Veilthorn line possessed, older than the Conclave, older than the breeding records, older than the resonance archive, older than the word for any of it. The attendants in the corridor shifted. Drassen's tablet chirped the harmonic had registered on the recording equipment, flagged automatically by the archival subroutine. "Matriarch," Drassen said, "that frequency, it's—" "I hear it. It designates a clutch guardian, The records show the last designation was 412 years ago. Yes, I know the records. Salvine looked at Khalid. The protocol predates the Conclave. It predates our current language. It predates every regulation the Breeding Oversight Committee has ever written. A nesting mother who produces that harmonic is naming a guardian for the clutch, someone who stays with the eggs through curring, through hatching, through the first year of growth. The designation is irrevocable. It is not subject to conclave review, matriarchal override, or committee amendment. She paused. She is telling you that you are part of the nest. Khalid Thirsk stood in a dead maintenance shaft on sublevel 11 of Terminal Korath, holding a mop, wearing a coverall uniform that smelled like pipe sealant and goat broth and 3 days of unwashed human, and a 400-kilogram Veilthorn nesting mother had just made him permanent family using a frequency that hadn't been heard in 4 centuries. He looked at the mop, he looked at the eggs, he looked at Salvine. "Does the clutch guardian get a bunk?" he said, "or do I keep sleeping on the floor?" Salvine's jaw opened by a fraction, the Veilthorn equivalent of a laugh that would never quite surface. She turned to Drassen. "Requisition quarters," she said, "adjacent to wherever we relocate the nest. The guardian stays within thermal proximity of the clutch through the curring and hatching phases." She paused. "And find him a better heating unit. The one he has is a fire hazard." "I like that heating unit," Khalid said. "It has electrical tape on the power cable." "I put that tape on myself. It works fine." Salvine looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them moved. "Keep the heating unit," she said, "but the quarters are non-negotiable." Khalid sat back down on his bucket. Rithani shifted her body slowly, until the curve of her tail encompassed not just the 3 eggs and the blanket and the heating unit, but the bucket as well. The uncertain egg pulsed against the warm wall, its thermal signature strengthening, its calcium matrix thickening, its resonance frequency beginning to find the rhythm of its siblings. Drassen logged the entry on his tablet. Veilthorn clutch recovery, Terminal Korath, sublevel 11, sector KL7. 3 eggs viable. Thermal environment maintained by station maintenance worker Thirsk, H, badge 4471, during 72-hour critical nesting window. 3rd egg, previously recommended for reabsorption by Drenmar breeding facility. Successfully laid with manual repositioning assistance from Thirsk, using veterinary heating pad and positional guidance. Nesting bond harmonic registered at hour 68. Clutch guardian designated, first such designation in 412 years. Matriarch Salvine Veilthorn present. Nesting delegation protocol observed. No containment action taken. Note: the guardian brought a mop. 3 months later, the uncertain egg hatched. The first 2 had come within an hour of each other, quick, clean breaks along the shell's meridian, the hatchlings emerging wet and blinking and immediately vocal, their resonance chambers already producing the low-frequency hum that the archivists would spend weeks mapping and cataloging. They were healthy, strong. Their wing membranes unfolded with the symmetrical precision of organisms that had developed exactly as the genetic template specified, and their scales, deep green like their mother's, with the faintest bronze undertone from the matriarchal line, hardened within hours of contact with the substrate's regulated atmosphere. The 3rd egg waited. Khalid sat in his chair and watched it. He had been watching it for 12 hours, through the first 2 hatchings and the flurry of conclave attention that followed, the archivists recording resonance signatures, the breeding specialists running shell integrity analyses, the attendants preparing secondary substrates for the newborns. All of it swirling around the first 2 hatchlings, while the 3rd egg sat against the wall, its patchy shell pulsing with the slow, uneven rhythm it had maintained since the day it was laid on a utility blanket in a dead maintenance shaft 3 months and 41 floors below. He'd asked Rithani once, during the long weeks of incubation, whether she was worried about it. She'd looked at him with the particular expression that meant she was not going to answer a question she considered self-evident. She was not worried. She was not calm. She was holding, the way she had held from the beginning, without calculation, without contingency, without the option of letting go. The shell cracked at 03:12 station time. Not along the meridian, along a diagonal fault line that ran from the crown to a point just below the equatorial ridge, following the uneven calcium matrix like a river following the lowest ground. The crack widened. A small foreclaw pushed through, then withdrew, then pushed again. The hatchling was working the brake with the same stubborn, arrhythmic persistence that had characterized everything about this egg since the day it refused to calcify on schedule. It took 40 minutes. The other two had taken 8 each. The hatchling emerged small and damp and slightly crooked. Its left wing folded at an angle that echoed the pelvic fracture it had been pressed against for 6 weeks in the canal. The wing would need attention. The Conclave's wing specialists had already been consulted, the corrective splinting protocol already prepared. But the wing was functional. It would fly. Crooked and late, and not the way the template specified, but it would fly. The hatchling blinked in the light of the Veilthorn nesting facility, a proper one now, with thermal substrates and humidity control and atmospheric regulation, and everything the Conclave's infrastructure could provide, and it made a sound. Not a cry, not a chirp, a hum. A low, tuneless hum, the kind you'd make through your nose while mopping a floor in a dead sector at 4 in the morning, and Halid Thirsk, sitting in the chair beside the nesting pod. The chair the Conclave had built for him, sized for a human frame, positioned within thermal proximity of the clutch as the Guardian protocol required, leaned forward and hummed back. The hatchling turned its head. It looked at him with eyes that were dark and ancient and brand new all at once, and it crawled across the substrate toward the sound, toward the warmth, toward the man who had held the nest when no one else was there. Rithani watched from the far side of the pod. She was clean now, fed, healed. The pelvic fracture had been properly rebroken and set by the Veilthorn bone specialists, the wing membranes checked and conditioned, the resonators tuned. She looked like a Veilthorn female should look, poised, powerful, her deep green scales catching the facility's daylight panels in bands of emerald and shadow. But she was watching Halid and the crooked hatchling with an expression that had nothing to do with poise or power, and everything to do with the sound a body makes when it recognizes someone who was there in the dark. The hatchling reached him. It climbed into his lap the way a kid goat climbs into a farmer's lap, all awkward angles and absolute confidence that the lap was where it belonged, and it pressed its head against his chest and hummed. Halid put one hand on the hatchling's back. The scales were soft, not yet hardened, warm from the substrate, and the small body fit in his arms the way small things had always fit in his arms, the way kids fit and barn cats fit, and anything that was new and uncertain, and needed to be held by someone who would not put it down. The crooked one, Solving said from the doorway. She had been standing there for some time, watching, her bronze scales catching the corridor light. The one they wanted to flush. Yes, Halid said. The shell integrity scan came back this morning. Its resonance signature is the strongest of the 3. Strongest the archivists have recorded in the Veilthorn line in 2 generations. Halid looked down at the hatchling. It had stopped humming and was falling asleep against his chest, its crooked wing draped over his forearm like a fold of soft leather, its small claws curled around the fabric of his coveralls. The coveralls still had the broth stains. He'd refused to let the Conclave replace them. It just needed someone to hold the nest, he said. Solving watched them for a moment, the janitor and the hatchling, and the steady rise and fall of the small draconic body against the human chest. Then she turned and walked down the corridor to the chamber where the Veilthorn clutch registry was kept, and she opened the 3rd egg's file, and she wrote beside its entry, "Viable designation held," and beside the clutch guardian's name, Thirsk H duration of service, permanent. Below them, in the nesting facility, the uncertain hatchling slept against a janitor's chest, and the janitor hummed a tuneless song he'd learned from goats on a dirt farm on Carrick 20 years ago, and the nest held.